Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I want to do a slightly different video than normal. Whereas we normally look at the Napoleonic Wars and wargaming in general, and then some specific reference to black powder comes later, this is a video that's basically entirely about black powder and about how the rules mechanics work. More specifically in relation to artillery. I've been thinking about artillery quite a lot recently. As some of you may know, I've done a two-part series on different kinds of artillery, and in fact some of the pictures you can see in this video today were taken after the second video was made, which was a little bit annoying because you'll see that there's some great pictures of carronades and mortars that were taken at Leeds Armories, and I hadn't visited Leeds Armories in many years before I took these pictures, so I forgot they were there and I didn't have the images when I made the video. A trip over the bank holiday weekend, I saw them and got some pictures, so I'll put them up here. Those of you who've seen the video on carronades and mortars, not really sure what they look like, well here's some pictures for you. So I'll give it a quick overview of how artillery works in black powder for those of you who aren't aware. You fire 3 dice at point blank range, which is effectively sort of 3 inches. Medium range, which again it varies on the type of cannon, but we'll say up to 24 inches. You roll 2 dice. And then 1 dice at long range. The British, using shrapnel, get to fire 2 dice at long range as well. So it works quite nicely. I quite like it as a mechanic. One thing I'm not super keen on is only using 1 gun for a battery. But in the supplements, it addresses this and suggests that you use 2 guns for a full battery, 1 gun for a half battery. And I think that works slightly better. The problem I have with it is the frontage of an artillery battery is absolutely humongous. And I don't really think that you get that when you can craftily sneak in that cannon in between those 2 battalions of infantry. So I think that is an issue. I think only having 1 gun as a battery is a problem, but I also think that the rules writers, certainly the supplement writers, have identified this as a problem, and they say 2 for a full battery, 1 for a half battery. I think that's fair enough. Obviously the number of dice don't change compared to that. So far so good. They've also got rules in there for rockets, which have changed quite a bit between the 2 editions. And there's also rules in there for howitzers. Now, again, this is something of an issue, because most batteries, well, let's take a French battery, for example. It had cannons and howitzers mixed in together. It wasn't as if they had a battery of cannons and a battery of howitzers. The 2 were in the same battery, and they did different roles, and they made the battery a lot more rounded. So I'd like to see some of the rules that apply to howitzers also apply to cannon fire as well. Things like setting buildings on fire, things like that. In naval warfare, of course, now we're drifting away from black powder a little bit, but you have things like heated shot and things like that. Not hugely commonly, but they were around. So I would have liked to have seen extra rules for setting ships on fire and things like that if you're using those. But to keep it back to black powder, I think that they should have added some of the mechanics of howitzers, things like setting buildings on fire, etc., into the main batteries. Now you could say, for argument's sake, that it's less likely to happen because only 1/3 of the guns are howitzers. So you might say a fire gets caused on a 5+ if it's a battery of howitzers, or it gets caused on a 6 if it's with a battery of cannons and a couple of howitzers mixed in. So I think there's ways around that rule. And overall, I'm not saying that black powder is a perfect set of rules by any set of means, but I think it gets the job done. The one thing that it doesn't do, and this is very much to its credit, is overpower artillery. Some of the other Napoleonic games I've played in the past, particularly Warhammer Historical's Waterloo, was absolutely horrendous for this. Made artillery absolutely ridiculous. And you get to the stage where any infantry that advances within range of artillery is just taken off the board. It's almost like it's using modern MLRS weapons in the Napoleonic battlefield. It's crazy. What I really like about artillery in black powder is it's used mostly for disordering troops and maybe shaving 1 or 2 pips off an enemy unit before they get in. Because of the rareness of the artillery, if you're using orders of battle or things like that, it's unlikely that you can be able to stop a whole attack with just your artillery. It's possible, especially if you're using something like a grand battery, or, you know, the way the French got cut down by the Russian artillery at Eylau. But if you're going to do it in general, it's just going to knock maybe 1 or 2 morale points off the enemy, and then it makes your infantry much more able to repel the assault when it finally comes in. And that, I think, is how artillery should be in Wargaming rules. Okay, so I appreciate those are fairly minor problems I have with the rules, but I just wanted to get out there that I don't think any set of rules is perfect, and kind of where my philosophy is coming from in what I want from Napoleonic rules. In this case, what I want specifically when it comes to artillery in Napoleonic rules. Now, we've talked about different kinds of artillery already in this video, and I did in the series. We talked about foot artillery, but there's also horse artillery as well. And in Black Powder at the moment, horse artillery has a couple of special rules that make it different from foot artillery. Namely, you can unlimber, so you can gallop to the place you need to be. You can issue an order to unlimber the guns, and then you can fire in the next movement step. And that's quite good. It means that you can gallop the guns around, get them in a position where they can fire. You could, for instance, use your cavalry to force infantry into square, and then order your horse artillery to come around to within medium range or even close range and blast the square with canister. So that's quite cool. But I think there's a major problem here, and I'd like to make a modest proposal about how to change that. So first we need to look at what that problem is. Well, in the example I've just given, the horse artillery is used after the cavalry have forced the infantry into square. They move up, they unlimber, they fire at the enemy. That's great. But that makes the cavalry almost the secondary arm in that brigade. So the idea there is that it's the cavalry who prep the enemy infantry for your artillery. That's entirely the wrong way around, and that's the problem I've got with Black Powder's artillery as it works at the moment. This is going to specifically refer to horse artillery. I think it's less of a problem for foot artillery, but at the end I'll talk about how I think the rule change should apply to both and why. So, the rule change I'm proposing is that artillery fires at the start of the turn. So before movement, before initiative moves, that's the artillery phase. Now, it's not exactly a revolutionary idea. A lot of rules have an artillery phase. Shako 2 springs to mind, and the artillery goes before movement. So it is used in different Napoleonic rules, and I think it adds something that is currently missing from Black Powder. What do I think it adds? Well, it means that the artillery then supports the other arms. It would support the cavalry or the infantry. So to go back to our earlier example, the artillery fires at the infantry, quite lucky, and disorders them. Now the cavalry get to charge, and the infantry are at negatives to form square, if you're using the rules from the supplements. Now I think that's a much better representation of having artillery, horse artillery in this case in particular, supporting the cavalry. Not the other way around. It's not the cavalry forcing infantry into square to make a better target for the artillery. It's that the artillery disordering the infantry to make a better target for the cavalry. And that, I think, is a very subtle difference, but I think it changes the use of cavalry in the game. As it is, I think cavalry can be limited in their use. I think sometimes they're very strong. I think other times maybe not. And this could help balance that out. I think that artillery firing before cavalry move, and to a lesser extent before infantry move, could be really useful. Therefore, I suggest, and I'd love to hear people's comments in the down below, what do people think about having a separate artillery phase at the beginning of the turn? The idea there is to disorder the enemy before we charge. Now, there's going to be some knock-on implications from this, so I want to discuss those just so we can get the full idea of what this rule change would mean. Because it's not just as simple as, well, it means artillery fires separately from the others. There's a lot of knock-on rules to this as well. So the first thing that would be a knock-on effect is defensive fire would potentially be less powerful. Let's take an infantry assault as an example. A French column, let's say it's already taken a hit, attacks a British line. The British get steady line, so they get 3 dice. Let's say they've already used their first fire. 3 dice, they're hitting on 3 twos because it's a stand and shoot, and then they're going to countercharge. So they're going to get, let's say they get 3 hits. The French ping off 1, perhaps 2, and they, well, probably 2. So they take another casualty, and they've got around a 50-50 chance of being disordered as well. The British, on the other hand, will get the charge bonus, and while they don't get the morale bonus from the French being in column, that will only last for 1 turn for the French anyway. I think the chances of the French winning that combat are very, very slim. Now, you could say, well, that's fair enough, you know. The French are charging an unmolested British line. That's not going to end well for them. And I agree, that's true. From a gameplay perspective, though, it makes it quite boring. It means that your close combat army, which you spend the whole game advancing towards the British, they finally get into combat and they lose. It's not very good for the French player. It doesn't encourage them to play historically, and it doesn't encourage them to carry on playing the game at all. So I think that's a problem. If, however, that British unit was fired at by the artillery first, they could be disordered, they could even be shaken. That means that they wouldn't be able to do the steady line, and it changes the dynamics of that combat hugely. Possibly too much. I don't know. I think that's one that we need to play test and find out. I've spoken to my group, and in our next Black Powder game, we're going to try and have an artillery phase at the beginning and see how that works out. The other thing is that it allows a bit of softening up before the French go in. Now, obviously, you can do that in previous turns. So if it's taken you 2 or 3 turns to get to the British line, you've had 2 or 3 turns of artillery fire at their regiments and, you know, possibly cause a casualty or 2. That's great and possible, but is it really? I mean, if you're firing at long range, let's say you're firing at medium range, you're hitting the enemy on a 4+, so you're going to hit them once, maybe, because you're throwing 2 dice. So on average, you'll hit them once. They shouldn't save it on average. They're on a 6+ save. So, you know, it's not exactly going to break the bank. You'll probably do a casualty, maybe 2 casualties before you go in. That's assuming that they haven't replaced that unit in the line with something else by the time your columns get there. Now, again, that's not necessarily hugely unrealistic. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I don't want artillery to be some wonder weapon that just massacres hundreds of guys in one shot. But the idea there is there's no real incentive for the French to take artillery. If you, for argument's sake, you form a grand battery, like the classic Napoleonic formation, and you've got, say, 6 batteries of guns. You're firing at long range, you're firing 1 dice each, 6 whole batteries of guns, you're going to hit on average twice, probably do a damage, maybe 2, because they're saving on a 5+. You're going to get a disorder, but who cares? You're not in combat, it doesn't matter. By the time you get there, the disorders come off, they've taken a casualty, maybe 2, and they've had time to rally one of those back if they want to. That's not great. That's not a great representation of French artillery, and it's not a great representation of how artillery works. Artillery needs to soften up the enemy for the assault to go in. So, the artillery going before the movement would allow that disorder to continue into the combat phase. That might be a little strong. Now, I'll be honest, that might be a bit strong. Maybe just -1 to hit from the stand and shoot might be okay, and then at combat they don't have the -1 either. I don't know. I'll hold my hands up. If anyone's tried it, please let me know. This is what we'll be trying in the next battle report, though. The other thing as well is that there's a plus side and a downside to it. Because you fire before you move, it means that you have to position your guns in a way that they're going to be able to fire in their next turn. So what do I mean by that? Well, for argument's sake, it's French versus British again. The British put down a gun which is pointing at a French column. The French commander gets 2 moves or 3 moves, not unlikely. He's on, command 9 or 10 perhaps if they're in attack column on a road. So they zip around and they're suddenly out of arc of fire of that cannon. Because the shooting happens before the cannon gets to move, that cannon can't fire next turn. What that's going to do is that's going to reward those players that think ahead with their artillery, or position them in such a way that they've got the widest possible field of fire. What it will also do is it will punish those who just plonk the cannons in front of the enemy and just say, yeah, you know, whatever, don't really put any thought into it. Just remember, as I said in the video, artillery is a science, it's not an art. You know, we often talk about the art of war. That's great, but artillery is a science, and that's why it's a technical arm distinct from the combat arms. So it really does encourage the placement of that artillery in a way that's going to get the most out of it. And that, I think, is to be commended. I think we should be looking at ways of improving how we play and making those decisions a bit more tactical and more rewarding because we've put more effort into them. So that's it, basically. I just wanted to make a quick video putting forward this idea. We're going to be trying it in our next battle report, as I say. And please let me know below what your thoughts on this are. Like I say, it's used in a lot of other sets of rules. And I think it'd add a different dynamic to black powder and make artillery a lot more useful. As it stands, I think it's not great. I think cavalry also suffers from the enemy being able to react too easily to form square. There's no real incentive to form square before the enemy declare a charge. Effectively, you can march right up to them, shoot, and then form square when they try and charge you. It's a little more difficult than it might be if you were forming it further away, but you know, the point still stands, I think. So please let me know what you think. Thank you for watching. I know it's been very black powder centric, this one. If you're not into black powder, well, thank you for making it this far. I'd still love to hear your thoughts on an artillery phase. Like I say, I certainly know Shaco 2 has one. I think In the Grand Manor had an artillery phase as well. Possibly Warhammer Historicals, I think, had a artillery phase before movement as well. Can't remember on that one. But please let me know. And once again, thank you very much for watching. I do have a battle report filmed. I had to film it across my phone and my camera. So it's a little bit weird. I'm trying to sort the levels out and stitch them together in a way that's not too jarring. So hopefully that'll be up soon. And I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.